member game analysis. We've been doing this for a long time. A lot of familiar faces, some new faces. Well, I guess I never see anybody's face, I just see their games. I feel, though, that I've come to know a lot of the people who've submitted their games month after month. Let me just give my usual spiel. Every time somebody asks, Jesse, will you look at my game? Here it is without any notes. And I don't do it, and I feel a little bit like a jerk, so I just want to explain. The whole idea of the show is to set up a process for people to do, let's call it a Soviet or old school training upon themselves in this new internet age, an age where we are constantly bombarded with this internet thing and all these screens and stuff, and it's very hard to just take a pen and paper and start writing down some analysis, some thoughts of your own games. It's a very difficult process, and I think that's why it's usually not done. Here's just like a sample of some of the notes I did. I think a year ago or so, I posted some of the notes I did on my website. It's a terrible website, but I did post some of the notes there. Um, Anyways, so that's the idea, to help people, encourage them to go over their games as a process of moving forward. And the only intelligent thing I have to say about it today is that the older I get and the more I teach chess, the more I realize how hard it is to improve once you've hit a plateau. Right? Everyone's going to hit a plateau. It could be 1200, it could be 1800, but it will be very difficult to progress after that. And studying your own games is really the only way I can imagine to get over that hump. And even then, it's going to be very difficult to do. The reason I think it's the only real way is at the time you hit your plateau, you've already got loads of bad habits. And there's things about your game that you don't understand. And only by looking at your game will you get some insight into how to change some of the habits. Of course, you'll never change them all. You'll continue at some level to continue, doing the same dumb things as in life, right? We won't totally escape ourselves, but we can, I hope, improve. And maybe a small benefit of this show is maybe I can once in a while say something intelligent about how you can either deal with your weaknesses or overcome them. Okay, let's start. I did the organization a little bit novel today. Normally I do it thematically, and today I just did it by whoever came first. And that's probably because I first felt guilty about not going over Homesar's game last time around, and he had submitted at the last moment. Okay, so, and that also might give you an idea if you're just following along and want to be here for when your game is, that I'm just going to go down the row, you know, so you know roughly when it'll come. Okay, so let's take a look at this first game where Homesar is black. I believe this is the first time Homesar has been on the show. So, very solid opening. I approve of this a lot. I think this is a great opening for black, especially because the main move here for white is a4, which A costs white a tempo, and B gives us this beautiful outpost square, which Homesar duly takes. And this position has been seen loads of times in decades of chess. So castles, castles, and now white plays knight h4, which is not well, it's kind of it's a new, I don't know if I want to call it a new move, but it's new in the sense that when I was a kid, this wasn't considered a great move. And the reason I'm going to say this has now become, let's call it theory, is because the computer really values the bishop. And even before the computer came along, there's a trend from Fischer onwards where the bishop becomes more and more valuable. So white is going to invest some time to get black's bad bishop, which seems, from an old school perspective, hard to imagine, and the old move was queen e2. Okay, so knight h4, bishop g6, knight takes, pawn takes. And so we've already got the first part of the struggle is now defined, where white has an unopposed bishop and black has a wall of pawns on light squares that work really well with his bishop on dark squares. And so the challenge for white really is to get some avenues open for his bishop on c4. In addition to that, he has a problem where his knight on c3 really is, for the most part, pretty terrible. Yeah. So the challenge, I think, for black is, too, I want to just mention that there will be a natural instinct to play moves like c5 and e5. And in general, I think black doesn't want to do it. e5 will liberate this bishop, and c5 will liberate both some light squares and this knight. So black needs to sit tight, which is what Homsar begins by doing. Bishop d2. And now, honestly, I'm going to call this next move a GM move. The guy plays g3, and although this leads later to his downfall, I think, at least on principle, it's the right idea, which is white should be putting his pawns on dark squares and highlighting the power of his unopposed bishop. And so that's what g3 does, and maybe bishop f1. By the way, actually, I want to critique just maybe at this point bishop d2. I think just from a classical perspective, or whatever you want to call it, it would be best to do something like b3, bishop b2, knight e4, just to try to ghost this bishop on b4 and get rid of the knight on c3. But okay, here we go. a5, good move. h4, a little controversial. So, as Homsar writes, this is all kind of well-known strategical stuff dating back, many decades. And the whole part of the problem for white, or black's compensation for losing the bishop and the center pawn, is that b4 square. So let me put it this way, there's a limited number of building moves that black can do, or at least it would seem that way. And the reason that's critical is black wants to build this position, but he can't do it with pawn moves, at least not yet. At least, or rather, I don't think he should be playing with pawn moves. So h4. Now, this move, h4, is again part of the downfall, but the guy's got his eye on, I think, on the correct idea, which is that eventually he would like to bust the position open with something like h5. There's no big rush, though, and I think moves like bishop e2 or bishop f3 or f1 make sense first. I like bishop f1, especially since white played g3. You'd think to yourself, well, you're going to play g3, might as well play bishop f1, right? And the whole idea white should be thinking of, I think, is later to open that light square bishop up and to get a Fischer endgame, rook and bishop against rook and knight. Okay, so here we go. h4, rook a c8, and now a weird move, knight e2. One thing I've noticed, by the way, a lot of great games today, and not too many fantastic mistakes. Knight e2 isn't a fantastic mistake, but what I want to note about it is that it's often hard for players to deal or recognize that this piece is bad. And so I think the thing just needs to get gotten rid of, and then white can claim a small advantage, I think, after something like knight e4. But on knight e2, the thing really, I don't know where it's going. Black trades. Probably could have left it there too with a move like queen b6. But okay. Knight b6. And here's a little bit of a problem. I want the bishop to go back this way, if that makes sense. Both to help the king, but also the bishop just wants to be out of the way, whereas bishop on b3, I don't really understand what the dream white has when he plays bishop b3. Okay, knight bd5, and the knight comes back to the square where it already wasn't so great. And I'll let you guys think about what black should play. Of course, I have the moves up. I was chastised once for having the moves up because then it didn't let people think about what was going on. Somebody wrote in with very nasty remarks about how I was so dumb to do it. Anyways, the reason I have it up so everybody can see is so that you can see some of the notes that people have written in. I can't read them all, but I wanted you to see them. And you can, if you're watching this in a recording, you can of course hit pause. Paul in New Jersey writes, isn't knight h4 similar to black playing knight h5 against the London? That's absolutely correct. And, another thing that's similar to the London is in this position, you could leave the bishop on f5 as well and just allow ef to happen with the grip on e4. So that's right. Now, here's this critical moment. I think one of the reasons Homsar submitted this game was just to ask, was his following move correct? And I very much think it was. So let's go ahead and look and then maybe talk about why. Well, actually, before I do it, let me just say, white has some problems here. And let's just go over them. This knight is dominated by this pawn. This bishop is dominated by all these pawns on light squares. He doesn't really ever want to take on d5 because then ed would be a good Carlsbad structure for black, very solid in the center. And in fact, if we want to say black has problems, it's that he doesn't have a big fat center pawn like white, and that this bishop might someday, it's not now, but might someday become a terror. And the reason I mention these now is that when we get the transformation of the position that's about to happen, a lot of the problems, those problems I just mentioned, are going to continue to exist for white. So here we go. Scott Post sees lead to a kingside attack. Actually, absolutely correct. Now, the weird thing about it is, after queen f2, though, it's not really an attack we're looking at. We're looking at just a real material imbalance. So let's talk about this position for a moment. White is going to lose the d4 pawn, and maybe even after that his h4 pawn. So one thing is, I don't think he can get away with sidestepping, by the way. That's important to note. If white could keep the queens on, he might actually want to do so because it's white's possible counterattack, if anything, where he can justify his lack of incredible lack of pawns. And in particular, the thing I really want to stress is that it's his bishop that needs to prove itself if white's going to survive this, whether it's in the endgame or in the middle game here. So let's pretend that queen f2 is forced. I think it is. Takes. Could have also played queen d4, but okay. Rook d4. And I think this is very problematic for white. And just a funny story I'll tell is years ago, I was playing in IM and I had like the 4 pawns or he had the 4 pawns and I had the piece. And I was talking about him having compensation. And he correctly said, what do you mean? You're the one who needs compensation. I'm the one with 4 pawns. Now, so let's talk now about the bishop. If the bishop is bad, which it really is, it's against just a rock, against this rock of pawns, then, we've got to say that black is better, if not winning. That's why this move rook h2, now maybe it's the best move that he's got, but I just want to say it's not the move he wants to play. And by that I just mean the rook does not want to be passive. Now, let's talk a little bit about what black wants in this position. I think what he wants is ultimately what he gets, which is actually to trade most everything off. In particular, to trade off the rooks. I, the one chance that white has, I think, is to somehow open the position. And in fact, I think you could say that if white somehow had the D file, then we have to change our evaluation of the position drastically. Note as well, this knight is terrible. So, it's the rooks that ultimately I think we want to trade. I think we also want to just make building moves like king f8, king e7. And rook b4 doesn't really destroy anything, but I don't think that's where we want to be. Bishop d1, rook c1. I don't understand rook c1. Why not something like bishop f3? Knight e4. Now this move, again, I don't think it ruins anything, but I kind of didn't want it. I wanted you to play something like rook d4 or king f8, king e7, just to build the position. But I don't think it ruins anything, so I'm not going to talk too much smack about it. Bishop c2, rook b4, and here maybe somewhere around here is when white really needs to start thinking about being active with a move like h5. Is white still much worse? Yes, but at least he has a shot at counterplay. Again, something like h5. Rook e1, and now we can't do it. Interestingly, black writes here that he's going after the h-pawn, which I guess you are threatening, but ultimately, if I'm black, I think really what I'm focused on is just denying all play, which is anything that might come up here. Rook e4, I think that makes things easier. And then we get this position. Now I think it's just dead lost. And black plays it well. I think f5. Now we bring our king up. You can't stop g5. And there it happens. White tries to get behind the pawns. And here he resigned. Now I want to say I wouldn't have resigned. I don't know. Yeah, why wouldn't I have resigned? Because at least you have dreams of creating a blockade on the light squares. I don't, black, black is not going to fall for anything. But the point is, these pawns, this extra pawn over here is mostly meaningless. It only has meaning if the bishop sacrifices itself for all three pawns. But, kind of hard to imagine. In any case, what am I thinking about? Just imagine a pawn here on f4 and a pawn on g3 and a bishop on the light squares, and then we can hold the position, right? Now, black doesn't have to do it, but at least white could have played on with the hope of achieving that and having black prove himself. So very nice. Knight takes e3. Transformation of the position. I thought it was interesting too. A lot of times you transform the position. It's not true that the defects of old in the position carry on, but they definitely carried on in that game. Pass pawn. I'm doing all right. About to head out for Christmas. Yeah. So you hate knight moves this game. Mostly I do. Now we're going to look at the Beast. The Beast is also new to the show. And let's read what he writes after his bestial move here, which is g4. Now, maybe we'll say here, old-time Sozin position. Not very popular anymore, but totally fine. This, of course, is the Fischer School of Chess, and given that this guy, the Beast, writes in that he's in his mid-40s, I can imagine him not being in the Fischer era, but having come up in that shadow. So this bishop b3 is, of course, all old time Fischer stuff, and g4 is not. G4 I think is a great move, but it's not of the Fischer school. This whole idea with g4 happened really in the 80s when it started with the Keres variation of the Scheveningen. And it's brutal. The Fischer style and the old time style was always to play, f4, bishop e3, and castles. And the genius of g4 really is to say that when I kick the knight with g5, that it's not just an attack, but I'm really making the knight on f6 weak. I'm displacing it from the center. So, yeah, just to put in perspective, g4, g5 is ultimately about the center. Okay, h6, and I want to say I think this might not be the worst move, but when you compare it to the Scheveningen, where you also get h6, then it feels really scary for black to me here, because when we have the Sozin, we'd really like to rip open the light squares at some point over here. That's our big dream. And now when you play h6, you've undermined the g6 square, which is the light square. And so it felt especially tenuous for me, this whole thing. Even though I think we're now, we're still in what could be called theory. Maybe I'll just briefly show how this works with the Scheveningen. It would be e6, g4, h6. That would be the comparative line. And like I said, this move g4 and move 6 is how first of all, the Scheveningen as a main Sicilian opening died. And then I think the idea of the g4, which is often used in the English attack, has come in to be like a main weapon against the Sicilian. In fact, there's a lot of kids out there that just don't even need to learn a lot of theory. They just always play f3 and g4 against everything with the idea of mating. And it's pretty effective. Okay, this position, though, is very hard to play. And so h4, I think that's okay. b5, and now Beast criticizes himself with queen e2. Though I've got to say that it looks very natural to play queen e2. He says bishop e3, probably stronger. Probably true. And this, by the way, is the kind of position, I think, where, to be a good Sicilian player, you really have got to be clever in terms of creating problems for your opponent. And the one move that crossed my mind here, I don't know if it's going to knock black out or anything, was queen f3, which, first of all, has the same point as queen e2, which is to control this thing, but also to make black worry about e5, and to make him worry about g5, so that we can protect our rook. And of course, g5 is the main idea of playing g4 in the first place, right? Okay, so b4, and I guess that's an exclam move from your opponent, because the knight is truly a little bit uncomfortable here. And surprisingly, after knight a4, this move bishop d7 seems to be working. I say surprising because when I first, usually when black goes on a journey to, go after your knight here, he's going to get mated. And so I was surprised in any case that he could pull this off, but I think it actually does work. So rook g1, probably bishop e3, as you wrote. I think I played a couple variations myself here with like knight b6. And you have that, and then if queen b7, you can do something like that with good compensation. With this, in any case, a very violent position. So you miss queen a5. It happens to us all. But here we go. a3 takes. And I want to say the first time I looked at this game, it just seemed abysmal to me for black to take on b2. For example, he could have just played queen c5 if he wanted to have been safe. Um, but just because it looks starts to look like a Danish gambit or something, right? Where these bishops are really strong. And in fact, that's is how he ends up getting hurt in this game. But if after queen b4, if it's true that you have nothing better than castles, then we've got to say that this AB was fine for him, right? Because, well, your king just doesn't want to be over there, right? Um, and at some point, a5, a4 could have hit you as well after castles. But I didn't see anything better, right, than that. Like knight f3 is wholly uninspiring, for example. So castles, knight c6, I think this is fine. You could have played a5 as well. And this is distressing. Now you say you missed queen f4. Maybe you should do something like f3, but you're already in a little bit of trouble. And this might be a good point to just state the dogmatic idea behind the Sicilian, at least as I understand it. Okay, and that is that what you're doing is, first of all, you start off with a huge deficit in development, right? That's why you might well get mated. But if you make it to like a late middle game, like we have here, White's pieces are often finding themselves controlled. In particular, in this position, we have these two guys really dominated by this e6 pawn and the a6 pawn over here. And of course, in this particular position, the bishop really isn't doing anything until our friend the knight gets out of dodge. So even though this might be technically a mistake, if you wait and play moves like f3, you're also just waiting for your own doom as well. So as white, you really are, you're condemned to violence. That's what's going on, right? Exclam chess, thank you for being here. Yeah. I thought DE might have been a little safer, but okay. Queen c4, this whole business happens. Good move. And great. Now what we have to say is black played normal moves, but you were allowed to play knight e4, and I think black could have done better to stop that. And now, all of a sudden, this is what you deserve when you play the Sicilian. You know, black was much better before. Now, all of a sudden, we not only got our pawn back, but the beast, the Kraken, has been unloosed here. Knight of 3 is not doing anything. Check is going nowhere. And rook g4. Some weird stuff happens here. Once we get that pawn, absolutely the end of the world. So here's a funny thing, Beast. Let's read what you wrote. We agreed to a draw here due to time constraints. However, I feel I have the advantage due to the two bishops. I also feel my c-pawn is a threat, and I have more active rooks. It's a shame I settled for a draw. Yes, but I felt I was losing the entire game and did not have the confidence to push forward, which is something I will need to work on. Yeah, and let's just say this. Beast, you're in your 40s, like I am. You're going to be playing these kids. You clearly like the violence. And one thing you got to understand about violence is, like in this game, you're going to get positions that will turn against you. But, like in this game as well, the positions are going to be violent enough that you are going to have a chance to do something like this and get counterplay. And right, you just have to condition yourself to say, yeah, I'm always essentially one move away from winning, right? And whether you're a super GM or playing at the 1400, 1500 level, this is still the case. And here it's important to say, I think you're completely winning because your unopposed bishop. I mean, look at this diagonal. It's absolutely stunning, and that square right there is so juicy. So yeah, this is a great. You could put this in a book of an example of the two bishops, because the his pieces are dominated as well, especially this knight. I have no idea what that guy's supposed to be doing in life. Knight e8 might truly be his best move, in which case it's never coming out after something like bishop e5, right? Okay, let's go to the next game. Mr. Fast wrote in. I'm calling him Mr. Fast. He didn't say what his name was. Another new subscriber. And let's take a look how it went. All right. So, this is all well known. And Rookie 1, these positions, I think they can seem complicated, but there's a basic, let's call it a basic truth about them that I think once you understand it, that'll help a lot. And that is that when you play c3, the basic dynamic of the game that you should appreciate is that this knight is now poor. You have your own problem with knight b1, but the fact that that knight on c6 is dead is really his, like, let's call it his positional problem. Another problem he's going to have is we have to wonder whether this bishop is going to be a beautiful opportunistic attacker or whether he's going to be shut out by d4 eventually. We're in no rush to do this d4 move, but that is going to be our long-term problem for black. Problem number one for black, though, is the knight on c6. I think once people understand that what you're doing is you're playing against the knight, then all of a sudden things become much simpler. And bishop g4 looks very natural, but I think it's just, I'm no expert in this opening, but I think it's poor because, let's say, castles knight d2 a6, which is what happened. The simple plan is to play h3 and let's say bishop h5, knight f1, knight g3. And the important thing to see about that position is not only are you breaking the pin, but your worst piece, your knight on d2, is becoming strong. And actually, I should amend that a little bit, is you can play, you should, play something to stop knight a5 before you do all that, because you don't, it's not just that you want your beautiful bishop, but you don't want him to get rid of his terrible, terrible knight. And you can do that by playing b4 as in the game, or a move I think I like better is just bishop b3. So if he wants to make his knight bad with knight a5, then you can just tuck the thing home. And again, it's not that you're preserving the bishop, you're saying the knight is ridiculous on the side of the board. Okay. b4, bishop a7, and a4. And I know this has been played, this kind of idea is played a lot, but I want to say in general I don't like it because it's unclear what you're doing, and yeah, I think what you need to focus on is breaking this pin and fixing this knight with things like knight f1 and h3, knight g3. So h6, he has other moves, queen b3, and one good thing about your position is that black, it's not immediately clear what black should do. But if you understand, if you're black and you understand what's going on, what your problem is, then what you're going to think about at least is playing knight e7 to knight g6. Not only will it, potentially lead to an attack for black, but you're just fixing that terrible, terrible piece. So, all right, rook b8, and here comes your high crime, b5, and I'm sure you just missed knight a5, but there it is, right? Black gets this trade. Now, the funny thing about the trade is, even though I like black's position a lot here, within the next several moves, you're the one who all of a sudden stands totally reasonable. And it's funny, there's a real transformation in the position over the next several moves. And these positions, I think, are sometimes a little hard to judge because what black really wants is just to be patient and wait for the position to open for his bishops. And it's not immediately obvious how to do it. So, for example, in this game, black plays bishop e6. Not clear that the bishop belongs there. Then plays bishop c5. Again, not clear that the bishop belongs there. And let's read what you wrote, Mr. Fast. You wrote, "This poor queen is bullied like there's no tomorrow." But in fact, I don't think the bishops are doing themselves any favors. You played queen b2 and criticized it. And I get it. Maybe, some other square like b1, but it makes sense what you're doing, because now all of a sudden there's the d4 question to be answered. Okay. Knight g4 doesn't make any sense, because here comes d4. And in general, black does not want to take on d4, because that e5 pawn is kind of the bedrock of his position. But now he might have no choice, because if he doesn't, then h3 is going to come, and then we're going to take this pawn anyway. So like I said, this transformation has happened, where now all of a sudden white can be very happy with the position. Queen c2, good. a b, rook a8, bishop b2, everything's going our way. And now queen d7. All right, here we now have, I think, a really instructive moment. Actually, and this could be an example of a position where going over the game with like just a computer might not be that helpful, because I don't know what the computer is going to say, but I'm going to say that the move in the game was too risky. Let me just try to explain. So white now played d5, and I think it's a big mistake. Now, I haven't looked at it with the computer, but I want to try to explain that even if the computer magically told you you could live with this move, I want to still say it's a mistake. So in this position, I want to really stress that you're doing great. And let's talk about why. Your center is amazing. This bishop is cut off. The bishop's over, this thing truly is in danger of getting snapped with a move like d5. Everything's going white's way. So, if you have to play a move like queen d3 or whatever to protect your pawn, I think you're either a little bit better to clearly better, something in that range. But now d5 happens. Now let's read what you wrote. "I think this move took me the longest in the entire game, something like 3 minutes." Now, let's just pause for a moment. This is funny. I called you Mr. Fast because his handle has fast in the name. But this is truly like this phenomenon that's going on in chess, where you have people who are becoming totally reasonable players, and they've never played in a tournament. They've never, played a longer game. So it's this whole interesting thing that I'm trying to wrap my own mind around. Yeah, and there's Mr. Fast doing his thing. Now, with 3 minutes, and of course, normally in a position like this in a tournament game, this is the move you could call your critical moment, and you would spend something maybe like 30 minutes on. And maybe even the wise person would play something like queen d3 and not even mess with d5. Okay, his opponent makes things easy by just giving the piece this way. But let's go into this bishop takes h3 variation and read what Mr. Fast wrote. The reason I could not decide easily is that on this move d5 is that black can sacrifice the bishop with this variation. My king side is ruined and the defense becomes very difficult. I finally decided to play d5 because I saw that I have bishop f6, removing the knight. All right, let's think about this position. First of all, I want to really stress that if you didn't have any choice, then sure, d5. But, you could have just defended somehow the pawn on b5. And in this position, it's really important to see that what you've done is that you've unleashed the Kraken here with bishop f2. And it's important because right away, black has the threat of queen g3 and then taking f2. Further, with bishop f6, I think what you're actually doing is you're unleashing the rook, because after takes, I don't see any way to stop one of these king moves, and then rook g8. Right? For example, if queen c3, then we'll go to h7, and if he doesn't play queen c3, we can play king h8. And to me, it looks very scary. Now, I did think for a moment about, since queen g3 is this big threat, whether I could claim that after rook a7, that maybe I am a-okay. Maybe I am. Maybe I am, because it is true that this thing is a beast, right? And maybe I can do things like, I don't know yet what, but maybe protect the knight and play knight f1 and try to survive. But I think in general that black has very dangerous counterplay, very dangerous play. And of course now he's got the rooks. So, an interesting choice. Let's go on and see what happened. In the game, black took on b5, and I think this really does make things easy. e5, good move. Rook b1, good move. Good move. Everything's falling. And then the game's basically over. Okay. Let's read what Railbird wrote. d4 seems principally wrong to me just because white has the two knights and should want to keep the game closed. Is that a correct assumption? In some ways, that's not a ridiculous thing to say, but notice that when you play d4, you're really making the bishop on a7 poor. Maybe we should reconsider that. Here was the position, and actually, like I said from the very beginning, the part of the problem for black when he plays this bishop c5 business is that at some point you got to worry about d4 making that bishop absolutely miserable, and that's indeed what happened here. So I think that's the reason why d4 is a totally fine move. Chapter 11, that's really funny, is asking me how much do I charge for game analysis like you are doing now. It's funny only because Chapter 11 it will make you bankrupt if you do game analysis with me. Chapter 11. I do lessons, and when I do lessons, I usually concentrate on going over people's games. And the advantage maybe of a one-on-one lesson is I have a little bit more time to talk specifically about what you need to do to get better, to think about strengths and weaknesses. And I try to do some of that here, but obviously we've got all kinds of people, and I don't want to talk too specifically about any given one person. Though there are many people here on the show I feel I have come to know quite well, and their chess. And I charge, I think, an exorbitant amount, which is $100 an hour, but I assuage my conscience for charging such a large amount by doing this show. So if that's too much for people, they can, they can come do the show. Okay, let's go on to the next game. We got Amit here, and he missed at least 1 month, so it's good to have him back. I'm going to flip the board because he was black in this position. And Amit generally sends us a game where he crushes somebody, and this game's no exception. Queen b6, and now a bad move from white, which I think is instructive. He plays queen b3. And I've spent a lot of time on this position, both from the black side and the white side. I think it's a great example of how to think about the space advantage. And the space advantage is something where I think it takes a lot of chess skill to appreciate. But even if you find it over your head to think about the space advantage, I've talked a lot about it on this show, then even as a chess fan, it's something that you should appreciate or enjoy. And the idea of the space advantage is really, especially this one, is to push all of black's pieces into a box, back into their hole. And the first thing we got to say is black's up in development and arguably up in center control because he's got two center squares firmly. Whereas really it's what white has is the space, and especially the space on his strong side of the board, which is where the pawns are pointing, on the king side. So to that end, the guy needs to not trade pieces. By trading pieces, you're not going to be able to hold your space advantage. You're going to have the capacity to fill up the space that you're going to leave behind. And so that's why this first mistake, queen b3, I think is just a good example of a mistake. So, takes. Now, I think this is okay to take, but what white should definitely consider now is to play takes himself, and at least this would give him the option of sacrificing a pawn in maybe an interesting way to get some development. Do I think that black is still better? I do, but the problem is when you just do it like here and you, in addition to everything else, activate the black rook, then this is already a very nice position for black. Notice that in these structures, black really doesn't have any weaknesses and white has this thing to worry about. Understandable, however, it doesn't, of course, do anything, and Amit rightly points out knight b4 right away. DZ. Well, just do it for one show, DZ, and then we'll get going for the next one. Maybe I'll try to make. By the way, I feel bad for kind of not announcing when the show is going to be. It was, of course, complicated by Christmas and everything. So normally I do this the last Wednesday of the month, but that is Christmas, so we had to move it around a little bit. I will say tentatively, right now, next show is going to be the 29th of January in the new decade. All right. So, king d2, it's looking ugly. Good move. Here we go. And I thought f6 was better just because you're probably going to want to play f6 anyway. There we go. And now, here's another example of a mistake here where takes, if you can, white really wants to take with the pawn, again, because his only chance here is to use his space advantage, to get one more tempo to play rook b1 and make the knight go back, and he should have honestly done it before a move like h4. But that allows the trade, and now also, sadly, this pawn. And the bummer about that pawn is now black is fully in the white position. And this is the bummer that happens when you play against an opening like the French and you lose your space advantage, and everything is really going to fall apart now. And Amit is, we've seen him here on the show many times. He is clinical in putting these people away. d4, check to the rook, activate the bad bishop, put him on a beautiful square. Very nice. Check, and then that's going to be painful. Yep. Nice game of meat. There it is. DZ writes, I violated the slow games rule and Jesse does not enjoy analyzing blitz games. That's totally true. Yeah, and I'm coming around, like I said, to people just playing games online. I understand, especially as someone with kids and it's hard to get out to play a tournament. Very hard. That I appreciate sometimes you just have time to play online. That said, it is possible to play online games that are longer. All right, let's do corner pawn. Corner pawn is also new to the show. And that was some interesting business here. So, corner pawn is black. Let's switch it around. In some ways, I want to nominate at least some of these annotations as some of the best of all time. Uh, this is what he calls the Portuguese Scandinavian. Now, let me just maybe make a note about this. I think what Black is about to do is completely insane. And this variation of the Scandinavian is totally playable. And you can play knight d5. And what you are going to suffer from is a mild space disadvantage, but all your pieces are going to get out. You're going to play something, that bishop's going to go to one of those squares, you're going to play e6, and you're going to be fine. Carlsen has played this position a bunch of times. This, however, oh man, here we go. And let's read what he writes, because I just think it's hilarious. So there's a lot of opening books out there, and clearly Corner Pawn has read this Smerdon opening book, and let's just read a little bit what he writes here. White's move, f3, is the critical test to the Portuguese complex. White's alternatives are bishop b5, knight bd7, bishop e2, the Lusophobe. I really love it, the Lusophobe. And then knight f3, queen d5, the classical. Yeah. By the way, I think White's better here than the classical. Bishop e2, the wuss. You know. Yeah, the wuss. Also better for White. In any case, I feel like all of these are better for White than this position, knight d5, which is just a small disadvantage for Black. I really enjoyed all those, though. The Lusophobe, the classical, bishop e2, and then this one, bishop f5, c4. This is the banker. He calls this one the banker. And let's just go, there's a couple other ones. Bishop b5, c4 is the Jadoul. And knight c3 is the Melbourne Shuffle. And g4, bishop g6, c4 is the correspondence refutation. Now, I'm assuming this is all stuff from the book. It'd be cool, I guess, if you made it up too. You know, sometimes on chess.com it'll tell you the name of an opening, and I hadn't heard of it, you know. I had heard, for example, this was called the Portuguese variation ages ago, but it's something I had forgotten. But I think it's great to have all these different names, even though if you want to play gambit chess, Corner Pawn, there's better ways of going about it than this kind of business. Especially because if the guy wants to get a boring position like this, he can get it. And he's better. And that's apparently not the kind of chess you want to play. Okay. Here we go. So look at what happened. So c4, e5. Oh my god. Oh my god. This move confuses me. Like, if you're going to do this move, why not just play e6? In fact, he mentioned it. He writes, e6 is the theoretical move on page 40 of Smerdon's Scandinavian. Yeah, and so maybe you get a position like this, and you have some compensation for your lost pawn. Okay. So, de5, this looks terrible. Queen e7, queen d4, f4 also possible. And at the very least, it's beautiful what you're doing here, because now, even though you're down 1,000 pawns, you're getting some squares for your minor pieces. Now, you write that queen g1 is the strongest reply. I'm just going to trust you on that one. I'm just going to trust you that that's true. Check to the miserable king. Because if bishop c5, bishop e3, I get it. Bishop d2, queen e7. And now, right, White needed to develop here with, as you wrote, something like bishop e2. Instead, a3 happens. Snip. And knight e5. Very nice move. Very nice move. And I guess the point is, if pawn takes, there's bishop c5, knight d4, check to the miserable king. Very nice move. And I guess that's the kind of move, it's just so enjoyable to do, Because also, of course, if knight e5, knight e5, I'm assuming bishop c5, this is the point. It's so enjoyable to do that it'll encourage you to play this kind of thing again. You can do better, corner pawn. You can do better. Okay, so instead, white bails out, and surprisingly, there isn't anything special for black. I say surprisingly because, this looks juicy. This looks juicy. All this stuff looks juicy, but apparently he doesn't have anything special. So we get this. Check to the queen. And you write bishop d6 was better, and I agree. And now we get this business. Queen g5, good move. And this is an interesting position where white is definitely better, but black has hopes of counterplay with the two bishops, and especially this beautiful unopposed dark square bishop. And I like your next move, h6. You've got to be active here. So knight e4, good move. And the next, series of moves, of course, mistakes are made. But mostly it makes sense to me what happened. King d3, for example, white could consider. There's a lot of different moves. But okay, we get this position. And white does well to trade some stuff off and get this position where I guess he's totally winning. Because we're going to go into a pawn endgame. And this is the bummer about being an active player, like corner pawn wants to be, is this is the nightmare, is that you get into an endgame like this, where you're toast. But corner pawn, he saves it here with a mistake that white makes. And let's read what he wrote here. You would think that every player with a daily chess rating over 2,000 would know how to win this ending. This is not so. This ending is not even mentioned in the theory books that I have. I guess they think it's elementary. Apparently not. Now, so let's first see the trick that black has after b4, and that is the move b5. And it's truly a little bit uncomfortable, bummer for white. And even then, it's white is still close to winning the thing. And so what white needed to do is play on his strong side and start bringing the king over here. It's still a little difficult, and I can imagine white being frustrated because, you have to let this king in, and then all of a sudden it's like, oh, maybe I'm not so, so totally happy about the king position. But of course, he should be winning because any pawn movement by black is going to result in the white king penetrating, right? So if you play anytime b6, king b5, king c6 is going to happen. And if you sit around, I'm going to assume a4, a5 is going to happen. But as it was, we had a nice escape here with b4, b5. If king c3, I assume just king e4 and there's no progress. So takes, a4, and very nice move, c6. Now I can imagine white looking at this position and telling himself that he's going to win and missing that c6 is so strong. Yeah, it's close. It's close. Snip, snip, king c4, a6. Good move. And I couldn't find any way to make this work for white. Maybe... Yeah, I don't have any fancy moves. Maybe he could try to mess with you a little bit more with a move like king d4 to try to get zugzwang, because a6 puts white into zugzwang, and then we're just following you around, right? So this is where the game was drawn. Nice game, corner pawn. One thing I want to say about these books and the let's call it the Simon Williams kind of chess is, first of all, I don't want to say anything bad about Simon Williams. I enjoy the guy as a commentator, and he's a joy to watch. But I have a student who unfortunately read or watched some videos about the lion. And that thing, man, oh man. Let me just show you briefly what that is because this opening reminds me a little bit of it. Though it has to be said, Corner Pawn, that your opening is worse, was even worse than the lion. The lion goes like this. Now, this is, of course, a fully acceptable opening for black if it's called the Philidor, like in this position, where you're going to play nice counterattacking chess in this position. But what the lion wants to do is play Queen c7, h6, g5, knight f8, knight g6. And at first, my classical sense of this opening was really offended. It was just truly offended at this thing. I've come to see that it's not that bad, but it requires such an enormous amount of skill to pull it off. And if you make one slip, it really is all over really fast. So I just want to say, I think a lot of these books that are too fancy are hurting people's chess, not only because they're encouraging them to play bad moves. And let's just face it, like when you want to sell a book, you want to, show some crazy business. Not only is it encouraging the bad moves, but it's kind of like encouraging too much focus on openings. Think about our dear friend Corner Pawn. He knows the names of like the Luciphobe and the King's Shuffle and the Dog's Walk, and the Dog's Sniffle. All these weird things, that are corrupting our dear friend Corner Pawn's mind. Okay, let's look at Ricker's game. Ricker, of course, has been with us for a long time. Ricker's in his mid-70s, but that hasn't stopped him from taking up the game and thriving. When he first began on the show, he was dropping pieces, and now it's not the case. And this position, a little bit unorthodox, but what you've really done here, Ricker, is you have played a setup against the King's Indian attack against the French. And so you're a tempo up on that. And that might sound weird to people, so I'll just show you what I'm talking about. King's Indian attack was, of course, popularized by Fischer himself when he couldn't deal with the French. And there's a number of ways for black to set up here, but I just wanted to show that what Ricker did was just the reverse of this situation here. All right, so d6. Now, Ricker, this was clearly this was a challenge for you in this position, and let's be critical of the move Rook e1, because although it feels like a developing move, it's only going to be a developing move if black takes, right? Whereas, what black should do is play a move like Queen e7 or Rook e8 to threaten e4. So better would have been moves like Queen c2 and or maybe b3, something like that. Okay, Rook e1, black blunders. And you correctly say you should take with the knight because now you have a little bit of light square weakness, and probably you should just take the knight on f6 here. But okay. Now, instructive mistake coming up with e4. So notice that not only are you up a pawn, but black has a real problem in that this bishop is now dead. More dead than it was before, because what black wants to do in the King's Indian is, make this pawn on d4 move. Now that pawn on d4 is never going to move, right? So e4 is a big mistake because now the pawn on d4 is loose. I get it. You wanted to open up your bishop, and you wanted to make sense of the move Rook e1. Unfortunately, after bishop g4, things are a little bit hard. Now, that said, I still think we can have a great position with a move like e5 now. I think that works out for you. But things went badly with queen e2. And now the guy took, and this is an instructive mistake in itself. When he takes, I think he starts to lose the thread. He doesn't need to take in order to take on d4. And it would be much better to keep this pin and keep this beautiful bishop on g4 doing its terrible deeds from there. Maybe I'll just make a brief shout out to the two bishops. Let me just put it as simple as I can. The bishop is stronger than the knight because later in the game it will control more squares. The problem with the bishop, though, is it only looks at half the board. So that's the reason if you have a bishop or a rook helping the bishop out that only sees half the board, that's why it's a good thing. And in this position, black gives that advantage up. And something I like about what Ricker does here, we saw this last month too, is from here out, Ricker really, I feel, plays good middle game chess. I was very similar actually to the one last week where we have a late middle game position where Ricker is able to find building moves. And let's check it out. Controversial with c5, bishop e3, good move. Rook d1, good move. Don't know what b6 is doing. Rook d5 is fine. Bishop f4 is fine. And notice what's going to happen here. Black is going to go on a journey with the queen, and this is our cue to not only win the pawn on d6, but to start creating drama against the black king. And this is exactly what happens. Snip, d2, simple and strong. Black's doing his journey over there, ill-advised. Very good. Big mistake, bam, and now it's all over. Thank you very much. Done. I think these last couple moves were like stockfish moves, and black actually resigned, as he should have, but let's follow it out. Mate. So, Ricker, I think you're doing great, man. I think, you know, I want to write a book at some point about not only analyzing your games, but the journey of us old dudes, could be old women as well, who have run into their plateau, as we will, and are now struggling to improve. And it's just very difficult, right? It's just very difficult to improve. And I do believe that going over your games is the one clean way to do so. And it's so easy, of course, to play blitz chess or puzzle rush or any of these other like quick things that might give you instant gratification. And it's hard. It's hard to go over your games as well. There's a lot of emotional trauma. I'll say that from personal experience about going over your games. Old Power, that's right. Nicholas, let's check out his game. He's been on the show a bunch. He's again here playing black. And again, we're going to get, actually, let me flip the board. Get a drink of water. This opening again. Queen c2's a move that's been popularized in the last decade. We're entering a new decade. And CD, I think, I'm going to say, is interesting. An interesting move where what he's doing now is he's going to a Carlsbad structure. If you look on my YouTube channel, I did a video about the Carlsbad structure for Vishnu, whose game is last because he submitted it late, and that was my fault because I didn't tell him that the show was changed. But anyways, in that video, I was talking about the knight going to e2. So imagine e3, bishop d3, and then knight e2. And that's more effective than the knight on f3 because this pawn can be used to control the center square e4. And I mention that because that's going to be a big feature of the game, I think, going forward. So e3, bishop e7, bishop d3, castles, castles, rook e8, knight c3, knight f8. And let's read what Nicholas writes. We have reached a main theoretical position in the QGD, Queen's Gambit Decline. I was not booked up for this, but I was familiar with some of the general ideas in the position. White has to decide between the minority attack, which is what's going to happen, and central play with f3, e4. And so I think that's a great summation of what's going on. And, one thing I want to say from my own experience as a kid coming up who didn't really have a teacher is that the plans with pawn breaks were the only ones I understood. And they're really terrible, usually, to play with pawns. And the why? Because pawns aren't people. I've talked about it on the show before. They're simply not people. And when you play b4, b5, what are you trying to do? You're trying to create some pawn weakness. But in the meantime, you have pieces that are suffering, and black's pieces are going to fix themselves. So, for me, hands down, the right move for white here is to play knight e5, and then later think about moving Federico the f-pawn. It could be f3, it could be also f4 with a Pillsbury attack structure, in which case it's white who's taking the initiative on what I think is his strong side, which is the king side of the board, where he has that extra pawn. Very dynamic and interesting play. And the beauty of it, too, is that when you play f4, and let's say later this guy moves and you trade off this bishop, well then, the nice thing is that you have put all your pawns on dark squares, so that guy is not your best piece anyway. Okay, so here we go. The minority attack it is. Knight e4, good move, and this is the standard way for black to solve his problem. So knight e4 is fine. And the thing I got crushed with by the bunch of nasty Russian dudes back when I was a kid in this kind of position time and time again, because I didn't really get it that the knight e4 was not only solving a lot of black's problems, but also, this kind of knight e4 thing can be the gateway to a counterattack on the white king. So b4, a6, good move. So if white wants to play b5, he's going to have to liberate our rook. a4. And now black makes a very understandable mistake. And by the way, I want to say, Nicholas, I think, this game I thought you played really well, even though bishop g4 is technically a mistake. All the things you've done so far really made sense. As you wrote, moves like knight c3 or bishop f5 are better. And let's just say what the problem with bishop g4 is. And that is, when you play knight e5 with tempo, this guy gets disconnected. But let me just say the reason why the instinct of the move, I think, is correct is you do want to start wailing on the guy on the king side. But and I want to say I like bishop f5 a lot more than I like knight c3. Because knight c3 gets rid of the tension, and really you want to force the guy to take on e4. And bishop f5 is just creating all kinds of drama about, the strong point of e4. I was also tempted by the move knight g6. Something like that, just to get our party started on the king side as well. I think you gave that variation too. You wrote this, and now something like that. Yeah, and that's an interesting position because you will get play on the king side, and of course it's dynamic, and of course, maybe you'll lose the pawn. But like I said, forget the pawn. The pawns aren't the people. This guy's a guy. This guy's a person. He's the one you better worry about, right? Okay, so bishop g4, knight e5, bishop h5, and b5. And so what white missed was knight e4, f6, queen c4, bishop f3, exclam. And I will say it's a very common theme that whenever the guy has to move the f-pawn, that different problems will arise when he does so. And that's also the case when we consider this variation with that I liked with knight e5 first. Where are we here? Instead of rook a b1 to play knight e5. I think some players would say to themselves, oh, I'm going to get hit with f6 later and it's a real problem. But even though that might be an idea for black, it will create its own special problems for black when he plays f6. And there's a variety of ways in which, of course, the f6 can go down. All right. So, where are we? b5, white missed it. And notice when people play with pawns, they're obsessed. Why does he play b5? Because he's been dreaming about this b5 move forever. He's not thinking about the pieces. He's thinking about his stupid pawns. We activate our rook after f6. And here we go. And we have an interesting position. I'm surprised that you didn't play f5, but maybe I'm surprised in a good way, in the sense that if he does take the pawn, you'll at least get some counterplay. He probably should take the pawn, as you wrote in your notes, but he played instead this business, and you played c5. I like it a lot. Very active play. And this position, I have, maybe the computer would even like white, but this is the kind of thing that black has been looking for the entire time, because all of a sudden this thing is active. Your knight's going to start hopping around. Your bishop has got a great square. And so despite the fact that you're down a pawn, and some people would think that this is just headed for a draw, what I love about this game is like it's clear, no, we have great chances for a counterattack, and let's show how it goes. Knight f4, thank you very much. We'll hide our queen away. He doesn't know what to do, and now we start coming. Bishop d5. Thank you very much. Check, and look at this. Simple and strong, and now I guess it's lost because our pieces are too active. Queen b5, and here a very nice move, rook g8. The point being, rook e1, knight h3. Beautiful move. And white resigned, and maybe I should show the points. If snip, there's going to be some kind of terrible thing like this. And also, if king h1, then the brutality of it is that we will then be able to connect our rook to that weak point with a move like knight h3. And now it's mate. We mated on king f1 too. So great game, Nicholas. And, Nicholas has done this show a lot. He's also submitted a lot of games where things didn't go his way. So this was a real joy to go over, where really, I felt that even the moves that you did that were technically wrong, like bishop g4, I still felt like they had the correct spirit of the position in them. Okay. All right, let's see what we got here. We got Paul in New Jersey. Oh, Paul in New Jersey. This is a rough one. So here's an interesting thought for us old guys going into the new year. And let's apply it. I'm going to use Paul as an example in this. Paul has submitted a number of games where he has collapsed whilst he has the attack. And I think a lot of the games that he submits, he is purposefully showing these games that have fallen apart where he's been on the attack and wants us or me to talk about it. And one of the interesting things maybe for Paul to think about for the New Year's resolution, or whatever you want to say, is maybe just to say, you know what? I don't feel good being an attacking player. I don't want the attack. And maybe I should even construct my whole business so I don't ever really get the attack. Now, that isn't to say that you will never have an attacking position. That's part of the game of chess, that, it's something that can happen. But that doesn't mean that you have to, strive for those kinds of positions. Because when you look at your games, you play e4, and a lot of it is kind of like a classical repertoire, which is aimed to get some kind of attacking position. And let me just say, I don't think this is limited to us, amateurs when I say that you can avoid your weaknesses. I thought a very interesting lecture, you can find that on YouTube as well, is at the St. Louis Chess Club. I talked about Fischer and the space advantage and how dude basically found ways to work around his trauma in being able or not being able to play it. And I say trauma in a way that I think applies to just normal people like us too, Paul, because you've clearly you're traumatized by whenever you've got the attack and it falls apart and you don't know why. And so I guess I want to say this. It's not that you shouldn't submit your games where you had the attack and it went wrong. On the contrary, you still need to learn how to attack. But it is possible to play mellower games where you flatten the position early and you don't even need to attack, where you play what I would call building chess. Your opening repertoire is like an arsonist, like Vishnu later. That guy wants to hurt people. And that's a possible way to play, but you don't have to play like that guy, you know? When I realized this about myself, I think it was a good and a bad thing, because it meant that I'm not an attacker either. I don't want to be. But it doesn't mean I didn't need to learn how to attack. But let me just give you an example. I started playing really boring openings. This is going to break Vishnu's heart, what I'm about to show you. But just said to myself, I like to play building chess, and I like simple-ish positions, and I'd play stuff like this. And it was partly because I knew that I'd break the King's Indian player's heart when I played like this, and they cry and they moan when they see it. But the idea is just to get a position that I understand, and really where I'm making building moves. I'm not attacking the guy, right? I'm just trying to improve the position and trying to get into a position where I can squeeze the guy. In any case, I'm not saying you have to play this stupid opening here. I'm saying you should maybe think about for the new year how to create opportunities where you can thrive. As an example from a totally different sport, imagine there's some soccer teams that just play defense with a counterattack once in a while. Some teams play open and free, and you have to understand what the nature of your players is, right? What strengths do they have when you decide what kind of soccer you want to play. And I think in chess too, you can aim for different kinds of positions. All right, let's look at it. The terrible the Dragdorf, however you want to pronounce it. It is possible, I think, to mix lemonade and milk. It might taste delicious. It might really taste delicious. But it just doesn't feel right, does it, when you start thinking about mixing the lemonade and the milk? And that's how I feel about the Dragdorf. What a terrible mix. In any case, here you go. When you play, Paul, you're gonna play a bunch of people, especially in American Opens. You're gonna play a lot of people who play weird stuff, like this guy with A6. And so let's think about what it means to play as an attacking player against the weird stuff that this guy's gonna throw at you. Now, because it's interesting to what I think is gonna come, let me show everybody what I consider, let's call it the main line of the bishop c4 variation, which could happen like this. Castles, bishop c4, knight c6, queen d2, bishop d7, bishop b3, rook c8, castles, knight e5, h4, h5. Okay, so back in the day with Fischer, there was a dogma, and it's a good dogma, that you don't want to move your pawns on the weaker side. So it wasn't until really after Fischer that this move h5 came along. It's usually thought of now as the Soltis variation, because I guess that's when the guy played it, in probably late 70s, early 80s. And it's a major bummer for white. It stops g4 from being a really effective move. And I think the theory gets weird here. It gets like bishop g5 and then rook c5, and no one understands why. No one really truly understands. It's like some computer stuff, right? Okay, I brought that up because I think it'll be helpful when we look at what happens next. So a6. And the problem with a6 is it's not clear at all if this move is truly helpful. In the Najdorf, you're playing a6 and e6 not to attack the guy, but to take away all the squares of his minor pieces. As I mentioned earlier, the problem with the Najdorf and most Sicilians like this one is you are going to be down in time, right? You don't have as much development, but you're trying to compensate for that by using your extra center pawn and the fact that this guy isn't in the center to dominate the white pieces. But not clear that b5 here is going to be such a big thing for white. Okay, queen d2, good move. Castles, castles. And now the guy really, I think, is just mixing up his business now by playing h5. And I have a hint of trauma. I sense trauma when he's playing this move. Like he's been hit by g4 before, and now he's just going to stomp it before it happens. So what are the correct moves? Something like b5 or knight c6. In both those cases, it's not really clear that that a6 was a useful move. And for example, maybe he's afraid of knight c6 and g4. Totally legitimate. And if we imagine this move as being useless, then yeah, you might really be in trouble. You made a great note that's not in these notes, but on the site. There's see people sometimes write something before the game, and you said something to the effect of, well, it's usually considered a truth that if you have opposite sides castling, the person with the initiative should have the advantage or win. And that's absolutely correct. And that's why black, I think, is already in trouble in this position, and especially in trouble when he plays h5 now, which is much different than the variation I showed before. BZ writes, my experience with this position is that black crumbles if he doesn't know the exact refutation. Yeah, or you could say the exact variation. You are clearly playing with fire when you play the dragon. Now, you didn't make a remark about the next move, Paul, but I think the next move is really worth thinking about. It doesn't ruin your game, but I think it makes it a lot more difficult. You played bishop c4, and to me it's really not clear that that's what you want to be doing in this position. And it feels a little bit like a move you're making by rote, as if to say, you got to this position and then you didn't, it just felt like the natural thing to do, so you did it. But the problem I see with it is that, first of all, you're going to owe the guy a tempo because you're going to have to play bishop b3. You're making b5 all of a sudden much more viable than it was before. And you're not really taking this guy out for being a heretic with this h5 move. As I see it, you have two moves here which make a lot of sense to me. Bishop h6 and the very simple h3 intending g4. And you will crack this dude now because you are going to get g4. And as I said before, before the Soltis variation came along, this h5 move, players generally thought you couldn't move a pawn like that in front of your king. And indeed, it's kind of surprising that black can get away with it in that main variation. And trust me, there were decades of dudes who just threw their pawn with g4 and said to themselves, I've got to try to mate the guy with g4. And it turned out to be very difficult, as it is going to be for you in this game as well. So I think h3 is close to zero, close to the end here for black. And let's just mention, if you play h4, this pawn will die, I assume, with a move like queen f2, takes, and then the party continues with the attack. Okay, so bishop c4. I didn't understand bishop d7. It made no sense to me. Bishop h6, okay. Queen a5, reasonable. Now, I want to make a first note that bishop takes g7, I would rather wait on, because once you take, you resolve the tension and allow the guy to do things like rook h8, which he can't do until you take. So again, h3 looks good, or even bishop b3, because you're going to have to do that eventually. And here's your move, g4. And like I said, you are not the first to fall upon this problem where it seems like you should be doing this, but in fact, you're just getting ripped open because rook h8 is going to be very strong. And I think here that you are already in deep. And it's surprising, but you're not the first person to realize that, oh no, this is suddenly very difficult. Now, you write that knight b3 would have been better. I mostly agree. What I really want to point out is that taking on c6 is criminal because now that pawn is going to dominate your knight. h4, I don't think it's going anywhere. And you're kind of doing, it's funny about h4, is you are like transposing into, let's call it the fundamental idea of this whole h5 business by black, as I showed you before in the other variation. Some moves get happened, rook h8, and I don't think there's anything much for you to do. The guy would have to blunder here for it to work out for you. So simple and strong. And let's just say this too. When you play, with an attacking repertoire, what you should expect is what happens here, namely that you're just going to have a move or two to make things right, because the position is going to be so volatile that one mistake will often be the end. And in this case, let's just say there weren't that many inaccuracies, but this is what it takes to be an attacking player. Like that felt wrong to me, bishop c4. And then g4 felt wrong to me, and knight c6 felt wrong to me. But by the time knight c6 happened, or knight takes c6 rather, you were already in a little bit of trouble. So anyways, those are some thoughts, Paul, for the new year. Don't get discouraged. Don't get discouraged. This is still, there's all kinds of interesting things in chess, and there's more than one way to play. All right, let's go on to Cam. Cam was his first time on the show here. Let's get this started. Now, Cam writes something kind of interesting where I put question for quotes indicates where I don't believe I understand something. And he was planning to ask his own coach. So now he's going to ask me. Fine. It's kind of interesting. DZ writes, the dragon is pretty good if you know it well. I agree. So here we go, and we talked a little bit in Nicholas's game about this Carlsbad structure, and this is in fact the, I think, more dynamic way for white to play, where he can put the bishop on d3 and the knight on e2. But black plays this move, bishop f5, which I think is mostly terrible. However, it has been played by a number of strong GMs. And the coming endgame is really what Cam, I think, is most interested in thinking about. And let's take a look. So queen f3, bishop g6. I just want to make a quick note. The reason why queen b6 is not going to work out is because there's this dirty check on c8. So bishop g6, snip. And let's say, first of all, there's an interesting historical thing about this particular position, I think. And that is to say that there are now a number of openings And this one came first, I think, in my mind. A number of openings where black accepts the double pawns but gets the bishop pair. We can mention the Berlin. There's the whole Rosalimo thing that we saw in the last World Championship. There's a number of these positions, especially that have this Ruy Lopez exchange, Ruy Lopez, that have this kind of dynamic. But I want to say this particular set of double pawns is particularly horrendous. And what's interesting about this game, too, is even though I feel white really misplays it, he ends up getting a winning position. And so the problem for black is really like long term, the pawns are really an amazing problem. Okay, so white plays a move that I don't totally understand when he plays h4. It's probably okay, but it's a little weird to me. My sense is very simple, and that is that white should be playing for the f5 square. Simple Nimzovician school, right, is that when you've got the weakened pawns, it's the square in front of the weakened pawns that you want to focus on. So to my mind, it's a simple deal in that that's what we're headed after here. Maybe a variation I can recommend, or just one that makes sense to me here, would be knight f3, knight h4, going after that square. Like, as the dogmatist that I am, bishop e7. Now, let's just point it out. It's obvious, but it's going to be important later, that black might play f5. And really, in his dreams, he might even want to play f4 after. So, the dream is that his bishops will be massive later. In particular, that unopposed dark square bishop here. So maybe g3, knight b6, as happens in our game. F4, there's more than one move, but I just wanted to force him to make this nasty f5 looking move. And now bishop d3. And I'm sure there were other ways of doing this for white, but this is just a very simplistic way of making the bishop terrible. I'm not interested in necessarily winning the pawn either. I'm just interested in having that bishop suffer for all time. Okay, but as I said, the move that you did, I think ultimately should be better for white as well. Knight h3, bishop d6, king d2, knight b6. By the way, Paul in New Jersey, this is the kind of opening you should be playing for black, even if I don't particularly like this opening. Get some nice ending position, make him try to come at you, and you just make the solid moves. Okay, b3, and you criticize b3, Cam, but I felt b3 was fine. You're dominating the knight on b6, and it's a little controversial because maybe a5, a4 is going to give some play, and as you write, there's dark squares that are loose here. But, it did have a positive note, which is that you're going to at least kill off the knight for a moment. So let's say that that's correct, a5. And here is where the first move you make that I guess I didn't understand h4, but this one I really didn't like, where you played bishop d3. It's not the end of the world or anything, but it just felt, it starts to feel wrong because your whole idea, I think, was to play knight f4 at some point. And the problem that happens here is that you don't want to play knight f4. And I think the reason that you don't want to play knight f4 is you think that him taking on f4 might hurt you. And let's just put it on the board. Now, maybe the guy does want to take on f4. But on the other hand, think about it this way. Pawns aren't people, and your knight on h3 is a person. The bishop on d6 is his best piece. So, yes, the pawn doubling might not be the happiest thing in your life, but it's much better to get rid of that knight and have the pawn weakness than have your knight sitting, sadly, on h3 for such a long time. All right. He plays king d7, and I want to stress that. Okay, that's fine. If I was black though, I would really be looking at a4 now. Knight f4 or knight e2, and again, what do I want you to do? I want you to play knight f4. And let's say the obvious. When you're playing knight e2, it's clear to me that you're thinking about how do I play knight f4 myself and not get double pawns. But notice the knight on, yeah. So this is a great example, Cam, I think, of the phrase pawns aren't people. You were obsessed with pawns being people, and no, it's your pieces that you need to care about. Once you play knight f4 and he takes, by the way, you're threatening to end his bishop's life as well. So it's your pawns are more beautiful than his, and they are a group where his are truly an island. Okay. So rook hg8, g3, knight c8. I wasn't totally thrilled. I want him to play a4. And now again, I think this is a terrible move because what are you doing? At least what black should do is force you to give us this tempo here, right? And this just, yeah, doesn't help. And now I think you're doing great. I think you're doing great in this position. You can now dream about putting a knight on this square. You can dream about dancing around with the knights. And a simple saying that has helped me a lot that I think applies to this position is that knights are good in blockading positions with local weaknesses, right? And so here we have a blockade and we have local weaknesses, whereas bishops are strong in positions with passed pawns on both sides and an open game. And that's just not yet the case for black here. You write here that f3 would have been a good move. I think so. I like it a lot. Again, eventually playing something, trying to get what you'd get in the game, by the way, which is great, which is f3, g4, knight g3, and then the big spank with knight f5. All right. So you correctly notice that you're losing some time here. But black himself doesn't play actively. He never played a4. And now he just wasted some time. And with that waste of time, now you are totally on top of the guy now. Good moves. He doesn't know what he's doing. You're doing great. You could take the knight, as you said. You went back. And here, basically, the guy has one trick, right? He has solely one trick. And unfortunately, we blew it here with rook c1. Almost anything else will save us, you know. Whether it's rook h1 or even king e2, we're doing totally fine. Bishop e7 was a cheapo. And if you want one thing maybe to criticize yourself is not just the tactics of missing f5, but the fact that rook c1 doesn't actually do anything, right? So the challenge in the position like this would be to find the building moves that you want. And king e2 is actually a nice building move just in that it gets out of any drama over here. It's a great position where you're gripping the guy and you have, I think, you know, well, close, we have complete positional domination here. Unfortunately, this one really is a bummer, and I guess it's lost because it's a pin and win situation. Rook h1, unfortunately, that hits everything, covers the bishop, and so now we're toast. The game went on, but black played well, opened things up, and unfortunately won our business like so. Simple and strong. Okay. So what did I learn from this game, you write? What is your opponent's threat? Question mark, missed f5. Misremembered opening plan. Yeah. Okay. I think, too, just to keep on a thread of what I was talking about before, this endgame variation is the dream of a certain kind of player and the terror of a different kind of player. So, you know, I think, by the way, this is what Vishnu, for example, who is an arsonist, should be playing for white anyway. But it's the kind of position that an attacking player might not fully enjoy, because the next several moves, what white's going to do is really going to try to consolidate the position and squeeze black. Whereas the attacking player wanted to mate, and you're not going to mate black anytime in the next 20 moves, right? But for tired souls like ourselves, Paul in New Jersey, this is the position for us. All right. Ingo writes, I believe I remember that Carlsen maneuvered both knights to f5. Yeah, and I think I have. There's a lot of games, honestly, like that, where it looks, and it's just over. You can even sack a pawn to get a position like that. Here and Now. Hick et Nunc, 1972. Here and Now. How can you get your game analyzed by GM Cry? It's very simple. If you go to chess.com and go to the forums and type my name in, you'll get the thread. And that's just by thread, I just mean, it'll say the next show is on X date. And all you have to do is submit your game there. There's a little bit of technical know-how to get to do it, but there's an explanation of how to submit your game. And the only requirement I have is that you spend some time making notes. And if it's your first time making annotations to your game, you might find it incredibly hard and unpleasant. That is okay. That is okay that it is hard and unpleasant. It probably is supposed to be. But that is how you do it. And like I mentioned earlier, the next show, I'm going to guess, is going to be the 29th, same time, 29th of January, next decade. And yeah, hopefully we'll do the show then. And we'll have the thread up in the next day or so, and people can start submitting their games. Hickett Here and Now says, I love to annotate my games. Well, good. All right, let's move on to Kevin Lee's game. Very interesting game. And a game, too, Kevin says his rating's only like 1,800, but this game was really intense, man. Really intense. I thought it was well played. And this maybe is a good example to talk about attacking again, because he gets a great attacking position here. And we had looked at this very same opening, I believe, against the very same opponent, either last month or, not too long ago. And black played the exact same plan in this game they did then, and unfortunately he got away in both cases. So let's see how it goes. This position, by the way, it's not lost or anything for black, but he needs to really get counterplay quickly. And my sense of this for black is he needs to make moves like that fight for the center immediately, like e5, f5, or queen d6, intending maybe queen b4, or maybe also just e5 next. All of those moves really fight for the center and the initiative. And that really is what the Grunfeld's all about, right? It seems like you're giving white the center, but in fact, you're going to try to murder the guy. Instead, black takes a lot of time out to go off and do what looks like an attack, but white is much quicker. Now, we had this exact same position, and the last game, let's write it out, was like this. I remember it well. And even this game, I believed in white's position here. There was total madness. Black somehow survived it. And this game, we're going to get something mildly similar. But I like what white did here, where instead of wasting time with king b1 and queen c1, he's going to be a little bit more efficient about it. And by the way, totally true what Paul in New Jersey wrote, that opposite sides castling, it matters a lot who starts attacking first, and it's the power of the initiative is going to go up. That is to say, initiative is always important, but that when you have opposite sides castling, the value of initiative goes up. And that just means that the value of other things, like the value of material, is going to go down in relationship to the value of the initiative. All right, so the first couple moves make sense to me. Bishop h6, knight ac4. I kind of don't like to take this thing, but given what happens, it makes a lot of sense to me. And I think you should be close to winning this position. And here's the first kind of question. Should we take the pawn on b5? And I think you were right to do it. Even though, again, the pawn isn't the important thing, actually, right? Like we were saying, the value of the pawns isn't that important. We'll see that here. You're either going to get mated or you're not going to get mated. But the value for us, I think, of taking the pawn is really that we are going to undermine the knight on c4. And that's what happens. So he says knight b2, and Kevin gives that an exclam. And hard to see what else black should do. We snip. Let's pretend that's correct. It looks right. King a1, rook b8, check to the miserable king. King g7, queen c1. I was very impressed with these moves. It seems like they're good to me. Bishop b5. And I think Kevin's move is fine. He plays rook h1. And let me just say, I think aesthetically, what I'd rather see than rook h1 is knight h3. Because I want to get the most important thing here is going to be force count. And by force count, I just mean the number of dudes we have in black's king's face before he starts any shenanigans against us. And if I just believe that if we get the knight on g5, it's all going to be over. And the point, of course, is if I get on knight g5, I'm threatening this, I'm threatening this. There's going to be, hopefully, it's doubtful that he's going to get away with any kind of king h6 because of some kind of discovery with the knight after he takes it. So rook h1 I think was fine, but I'm just going to give a shout out for knight h3 on the principle that when you're attacking, you want to bring everything in. So rook h1, queen d6. Now, let's give this guy a little bit of props because he's clearly a Houdini artist here, right? He's saying, let's just say, what is he saying? He's saying, okay, you can bring your lady in, and my king is going to go scramble in the pocket. And so it's this interesting problem where now we have to decide: do we want to play queen h6 or not? If we play queen h6, of course, what black is saying himself is that this queen is going to come make some counterplay. Now, the good news, however, about queen h6 is that now our knight would come in with check. So even if our queen has to go back like a sad sack, we are going to come in here with check now. So that's the advantage of doing it that way. But let's say that your move was still okay. Knight h3. The guy plays h5. And this next move is the only move I feel, I don't really like. Though even then, I think you're doing fine. You played queen c3. And I want you to put that knight on g5. You know? Once you get that knight there, I don't see how... okay, the guy has chances to survive, but there are simply big problems for the guy once you put the knight on g5. It's going to be very hard for him to avoid all kinds of things here with this problem, right? Also, you still have your queen c3 idea. And I'm going to guess you missed this Houdini move here, queen g3. Nice move. And by the way, let's just say this guy played an unsound opening and got himself into a miserable position. But now he's playing very resourcefully to give white some grief. And white all of a sudden is going to have to watch out, because if he doesn't get his knight in, And now it's honestly a little bit hard to see how the knight does get in. Then we're going to have some troubles of our own. So rook d2, bishop d7, rook c2, and snip. And so black gets rid of the thing. And now we just have a full-on mess where black gets to decide if he wants to get this draw or not, and he decides no, he wants to fight, and I think correctly so, and he's playing some great moves here with king f8. And the king survives, and now white is going to have to come back to try to live through this. Okay, now, somehow, Kevin, you are not totally lost in this position. I thought when I first saw it that you had to be losing here. Just because your rook on h3 is now completely out of the game. Okay, and I thought at first that black's move c5 was fine, and maybe it's still fine. Snip, snip. Rook d1. Scaring me because I want you to bring the rook back, but I get it. Rook c7, good, and I believe, yeah, I thought this is great now for black because his rooks are more active. Rook back, and I think that the one Houdini thing that you're now doing is that on rook c2, you're hoping to like live with that, and somehow you're not getting mated, or you're not, the rooks aren't getting their full dance. Rook c2 was still a very good move. I think, let's say snip, snip. That's also very dangerous looking to me as well. But let's give his move a chance. Rook c4, g4, very good. I like this move a lot because you have to activate your rooks. Pawns aren't people. You are ruining your beautiful pawn structure, but pawns aren't people. And this is a great move because it really is going to put you in the range of maybe drawing this game simply through your rook activity. And, I'm sure this game was a disappointment for you, Kevin, but this part of the game where you save the poor endgame, I thought was really nice. And like I said, I thought when I saw this position, I said to myself, black should probably be winning. But you really are riding a razor's edge here to hold this together. And I couldn't, at least I didn't see any easy way for black to try to take you out. So the game went snip, snip, and g5, very nice. And we're going to see is Kevin's idea is that maybe we're going to be able to harass the black king enough to claim we have counterplay. Rook b5, check to the rook, check, and there's really no good way out. And the draw was agreed here. Kevin writes, we can do this kind of game, but this is very dangerous, in fact, for black, as we saw there. That's something where it can go wrong. I do think he doesn't have anything better than a draw. So that was a very nice example of saving the bad rook endgame through activity. No Rematch says, you aren't going to do the 1 hour shows anymore, question mark. Thank you for the question. That's going to be a question for my own New Year's resolutions, I feel. I feel like it's kind of hard. It proved hard in the last bit of time. Well, basically what happened was I was doing them pretty consistently, and then I got taken off to St. Louis to do a bunch of chess commentary and yada yada there, and I fell out of the habit of doing it, and I haven't really picked it up besides this show, which I enjoy this show a lot more than the other ones, just because this one, well, yeah, because there's this great community of people doing it, and a lot of people usually come to watch, and then yada yada. Anyways, I will think about it. If you want me to do the 1 hour shows, I need help. I need support. I need some people to come and watch it. And anyways, that's part of the reason. It's also just because I got a little bit overwhelmed. We'll see in the new year, though, if I start doing that again. Zombie Chess says hi. I say hi back. Let's look at RN's game. This I thought was interesting mistakes in the King's Indian. That Vishnu, who is trying to play the King's Indian, should pay, I think, particular attention to. So here we go. F3, good move. As we saw with Kevin's game, D5 would now transpose to his variation that we got in that game. And now white kind of loses the thread here. This is a very interesting position. When I was a kid and played this for white, I like to do this and then try to murder black with like the h4, h5. And what I really didn't understand is that is black's side of the board if we get the e5 pawn structure. Maybe we'll talk about that in a little bit. But anyways, that was a fun way to play. This same-ish, though, is really about space and controlling the business. And the bishop d3 might be playable, but the fact of the matter is it's not clear that it's actually developed on d3, i.e., what is it doing on d3 besides just kind of being out? I don't know what it is doing, and it's also in the way of stuff as well. So that's the reason why bishop d3 is a little bit funny. All right, black can do a number of things. He plays e5, d5, knight a6, a3. A3, of course, controversial because it's unclear if black has enough, white has enough time for all this. So knight h5, very good move. Bishop e3, knight f4, good move. Now, we're coming to the point of the game where I want to talk about most. And it's a thing that King's Indian players often have difficulty with. And that is, let's talk about it in clear text, right? So the beauty of the King's Indian is your pawns are pointing this way, and that means it's really going to be your side of the board over there, and that's why white often finds himself mated. Now, it is up to you then to find creative ways to play on that side of the board. The most traditional way, of course, is to play f5. And there's other ways, such as knight f4, which is a fine move. The difficulty with knight f4 that I want to stress, though, is that when you play f5, you are in your own way of f4. And that can often create confusion because it's unclear what the plan is. Of course, the traditional King's Indian plan is to play f5, f4, g5, g4, and we go mate the guy. But of course, if your knight's in the way, well, that's a different kind of problem. So white plays the ambitious bishop f1, f5. Okay, I think that's correct. And now g3, we have, I think, a very instructive position. It's a instructive mistake that's about to happen. Now, first of all, part of black's soul should welcome the move g3 because that is really white's weak side of the board, and whenever you make weaknesses on your weak side of the board, it's going to enable your opponent, who's on the strong side, in this case black, to more easily rip you open. Okay, so the correct move after g3, I think, would be knight h5, and now f4 is a real threat, as I said, to open the business up. Now, so here's the interesting mistake. Black plays fe, and even there is a beautiful idea behind this move, but it's still a remarkable positional mistake. And the way to remember this is the simple phrase that all Russian schoolboys know to take back with the pawn. And what they're talking about when they say that is that if white ever takes here, you are instructed to take back with the pawn. The reason is you do not want to cede control over the e4 square to white. That is something you want to fight for. So we're going to see black has some very beautiful ideas with fe, and we're going to look at those. But the simple move for white now would be to say, thank you very much for making my knight an absolute monster. And unfortunately for black, I guess you're going to have to go back, and now you don't have anything. And white has a number of good moves now to harass you, and there's no counterplay. This guy's dead. There's literally nothing more for black to do anymore. The knight is dominated. So there's beautiful choices here with knight h3 intending knight g5, bishop h3. If you want, you could probably get away with b4, just dominating the knight. Positional domination. Okay, so, but now, one of the interesting things, of course, is, g3, fe4. Black does have an amazing idea, and white falls for it here with snip and snip. And the beauty of this is that, in general, the King's Indian player really should always think about opening up the bishop on g7. Actually, an example that often comes up in these kinds of positions with knight f4 is that if white ever plays queen d2, a lot of times you'll see this and they're thinking like, oh, I'll snip the knight. Well, yeah, you let him snip that knight, buddy. That is definitely his best bishop there on e3, and you opening up your bishop is by all means worth the cost of the pawn. Okay, so let's go back to the game. So here we go, ef4, beautiful position. Bishop d4, and here's an interesting little thing that happens. My immediate intuition is that black should play e3, and Rn, who if he comes again, he should give us his real name or a different name or a funner name than Rn. Rn noticed that h4 was a thought, and I certainly believe in black's position here. But it is true, maybe it's not totally simple, right? In particular, like we can imagine a queen coming here. I'm assuming, some knight c5 very soon. I believe in black's position. I want to put it that way. But it is clear, it is true that I also don't know at all what is happening. Okay, so instead, we said check to the miserable king. This guy came back, and then bishop c3, which feels heretical, queen f6. And this is, arguably genius level, because now, well, white needs to realize that he's in trouble, first of all, and I'm guessing that on bishop d4 we're just going to get a repeat, and that would be the sober thing for white to do at this point. Right, I don't see any great way out of it for black rather, to avoid the repetition. Instead, white plays queen c2, and after e3, I'm going to say white is totally busted. He's down in time. His king is open. The knight on a6, which is truly before the problem piece for black, is now going to be a monster. We're coming out with our good bishop. The other rook's coming over. And now Rn wipes him up here. Snip. Knight c5. Thank you very much. He correctly notes that knight d3 is stronger, but we get the same deal right here, and bam, time to resign. So, beautiful King's Indian game, and like I said, I think that lesson of the e4 square is a very important one for King's Indian players to realize. The pawn, all Russian kids know to take back with the f-pawn. I should have said in the patriarchal way, all Russian boys know to take back with the pawn. All right, every Russian schoolboy. All right, my friend Alex Yermolinsky had a show for a long time. I'm sure you can find it on the web, called Every Russian Schoolboy Knows, and I think that originally comes from that phrase, but that was a great show I can recommend. Okay, this is Tim. Let me flip the colors. I think Tim was originally submitted a game and then probably what I'm going to guess would happen, then played this game, and then, submitted this game instead. And I should write Tim's name here just to make things complete. Oh, I did. No, I haven't. Okay, so let's look. Knight d7, a little strange, but okay. a3. Now, let's read what you wrote. This move looks interesting, and it feels like I have to stop b4 or something terrible will happen. And I think this next move is a very important mistake that you make here. One instructive thing that I was told once, it's kind of a joke, but it had a lot of truth to it, was I was talking to Super GM Jan Elvis, and he said something in a drunken stupor, he said something to the effect of a3 is always useful. And that proves itself in this game too, where the a3 move controlling b4 is not just about some kind of space grabbing business with b4, i.e., like a minority attack. It truly is to say that the square control is what white wants with the a3 move. Now, a3 is, of course, a very strange move. It's not necessarily the greatest move here. And what black should do, I assume, is something like bishop e7 and castle and claim that he's up on time. And I think he's doing fine. Whereas a5, we've given white a very important move with a3, whereas a5 doesn't really help us. And also maybe we've created some weaknesses on the queen side. So bishop g5, e3. And this is a position that can arise with the moves a3 and a5 omitted, and to me it's obvious that this is beneficial to white. Not only is he controlling the square, the bishop gets to come back, but also if and when black decides on the standard c5 counter break, then the b5 square is going to be weak. And that's what happens. c5, castles, knight b6, knight d5. And my sense here is that white is doing absolutely fantastic, and it's mostly to do with time because black's bishop on c8 is misplaced. Variety of good moves here, I feel like, for white. Rook e1, knight e5. White plays rook c1. That took me a while to come around to, but I think I like it. And black plays b6. And here, white misses, I think, a chance for a clean advantage that Tim notes, which is knight d5, knight d5. And instead of bishop e7 like the game, he should play bishop d5. And this position, well, this position is abysmal. It's truly abysmal for black. Well, this knight is going to be stronger. We've got a tempo if we want it. We've got queen c2, queen c7. And my memory is that there was a game that Botvinnik played, very similar position, and yeah, it became clear that this was just untenable, this kind of situation. And mostly it's to do with time. Now, when we look at what happens, it turns into an interesting polemic, or whatever you want to call it, about the isolated queen pawn, right? So let's just talk basics. The advantage of the isolated queen pawn is that white has a center pawn and black doesn't, and that extra center pawn can be used to bully the minor pieces in particular. But if you start trading stuff off, it's harder and harder to bully people when they're all gone, right? When they're gone away, it's harder to bully them. And that's what's happened to a large extent with this series of exchanges. Now, I still believe white is totally fine, but he needs to understand that he has to act immediately before black consolidates his position. It's clear, he just needs a couple moves like bishop b7 and bishop d5 or knight d5, and he's going to be okay. So what happens is rook e1, knight d5. I want to say I like bishop b7 better. Queen d2. I don't like queen d2. I would rather see something like knight e5. Yeah. Queen d2, bishop b7. It feels to me like white has missed his chance. Knight g5, I don't understand that move. Knight e4. And now we have to say the knight on e4, you can imagine sometimes it would be a beautiful piece, but this pawn is now working fantastically against the knight, and I don't see where the knight's even going. So now black is going to do some simple things, which is let's start trading off stuff. I didn't understand that. I thought rook c8. There we go. Queen d3, knight f6. Check the miserable king. Nice move. And now, this happens a lot when these things all trade out. We got a just fantastic play against the white king. And the overextension of white is becoming clear. In addition, of course, the bishop on b7 is an absolute monster. Passive, but what are you going to do? Good move. Good move. Great move. And I guess this is now either lost or close to lost. Yeah. All well played. Beautiful. So, Tim, fantastic move. If he doesn't play this, knight takes a5 though. I mean, I get it why he did it, right? It's hard to move. So, all well done. He's got to do something, and then the poor knight is simply going to fall. So, very nice game, very nice finish. Yeah, that was a great game, Tim. Let's read what you wrote a little earlier here. Bishop a... So, b5, and here's what you said. Here was his last chance to try to save the game with knight d2, and the king and pawn endgame does not look attractive. I would still have winning chances due to the bishop against knight, but it would not be lost for white as the game continuation. And instead you give a variation with e5 instead of b5. Now I do want to actually make a quick note before we move on to the next game, is that I want to say that in general f3 is a bad move. Okay, and I think this is actually a good example of it. The reason f3 is a bad move is because, well, first of all, what you're saying to yourself when you play f3 is my pawn is going to be safe because it's on a light square. And it's a passed pawn, so it looks cool. But in the middle game, and especially even the end game, you really want to pay attention to try to get your pawns on dark squares. Because, like we said earlier about the two bishops, you want the other color of the bishop to complement your bishop that's only touching half the board. And so here you can use your pawns to touch the other half of the board. So my sense anyway is that the easy way, the correct way, whatever you want to call it, for you to play this is to play king g7 and f6 like you did, but leave this guy here. It's not easy for white to get at that pawn either, and it really fixes this pawn on g2. You might well lose, as in the game, a pawn like on b6 or a5, but I don't think it's going to save the guy. So let me just, summation. In general, put your pawns on the opposite color of your bishop, whether it's the endgame or the middle game or the opening. My sound is fading. Here and now, am I better? When he goes away from the mic sometimes. Sorry about that. It's true. Sometimes I talk forever. My throat gets dry. And here we go, and I start wandering, relaxing away. I haven't been drinking yet, though. Christmas is soon upon me. I don't usually drink, but Christmas time, it will be my fate. Okay, here we go. The famous Marty Cortinas playing the Tuesday Night Marathon. If you're ever in San Francisco, you should check out this tournament. At the very least, check out my old club, the Mechanics, where Marty plays pretty regularly. And let's get into it. This is kind of a weird system, but okay. And if you're going to do this, Marty, we should talk about the dynamic that happens here. So c5 is okay. Castles. Now, black is actually in a little bit of trouble here, and it's important to understand why. The grief that he's put himself in is that if he cannot stop b4, b5, then it's simply going to be a very unpleasant position for him. And it's all about tempo. There's a variety of positions that look like this. And the question is simply, can white do it or can't he? If he can do it, he should. And the simple point is, like, let's say knight d7, b4, a6. I will get this move off, and it is going to hurt. It is not simply about undoubling my double pawns, by the way. It is about creating a weakness on c6 and opening up the game, sometimes even, for the bishop on g2. But you can imagine this structure happens a lot. You can imagine the pawn being on e3 and a bishop being on this diagonal as well, with this b4, b5 trick. So castles, here's your first moment to play b4. And let me just play a couple natural moves just so you feel the ferocity of this b5 thing. It's very hard for black to do anything, first of all. And you are about to support your own center with b4. And this takes and rook a6 thing is coming. And it's just a really weak point over there on c6. Yeah, it's a major problem. So that's why they tell you not to do it this way. That's right. Okay. And now I think partly because of this, things start going awry for you. So you write, with the queens off, I should be thinking about how to approach a middle game with endgame leanings. I became obsessed with getting the f5 bishop off the board. That's a bit harder now as c2 is available and it hits b3 from there. Another factor not considered is that white's center is a bit rickety at the moment, so b4 at some point would help prop it up. Didn't consider it here, did later, but I did end up playing it very late in the day. Right. Okay, b4 by all means. Let me just show something briefly. You can imagine there's going to be a variety of positions with this structure. And let's just say that the guy plays knight bd7 and you spend a tempo, say, castling. Well, then what black should very much do is play a6, and when b4 happens, just get out of dodge. Or, of course, now he can just castle, so there's no actual b5 threat once you get all those tempi in, right? And once that's contained, then the position is, roughly equal, and black can think about things like bishop d8, bishop c7, and the game will go on. All right. So I thought it was interesting that you confessed that you were obsessed with the bishop, and we're going to see that it really drives you manic here. We're going to see one of the most ugly positions that happens, Marty, because of your obsession. Bishop f4. Lately, it seems I've become fixated on preventing e5. We get it. We get it. And the thing to see about is e5 isn't necessarily all it's cracked up to be for black, especially if you can get b4 in. And a lot of times, even, when he plays it, things open and this guy gets to go here and your pawn gets to go here. And so, right, e5, at least at this particular moment, isn't the thing we're afraid of. Knight h5, and now a crime that, well, it makes us want to cry here, Marty, because you're obsessed with bishop c2, you play this thing, and honestly, yeah, just don't. This knight's terrible. This knight's terrible. Just move this bishop back. Get out of there. Total obsession. Complete obsession. The bishop's getting away, and then this terrible thing happens where he plays f5, and now you get the dreaded Irish pawn structure. And this has got to be lost. Not only are the pawns bad, but your knights are terrible. This guy on c3 in particular is just totally dominated. Yeah, so should be lost. And this one's not just pawns. This is the pieces as well. I think he should be playing things like a6 and then bishop d8, c7, and then do the nasty by playing all over your pawns. He plays rook f6 first. h3 is a little weird to me. h6 is a little weird to me. I think he should be playing a6. By the way, actually, this is actually a good moment. When he played rook f6, let's not play h3. What he gave you was the opportunity for b4. And it's important to note that you actually have interesting counterplay. I didn't notice this, by the way, the first time I looked at this game. Once you get b5 in, you will get play. And no matter what he does, you're going to get play b5 and you're going to play b4. And this thing will probably turn into a pass pawn. This thing will turn into a weakness. That thing will turn into a weakness. And this rook that went on a fancy excursion, I think, is just out of the way. Okay. So rook f6. Important dynamic. If you play this kind of position a lot, that you will get this c5 position, a structure quite a bit with different variances. A lot of London players get this kind of position as well. The Worst at Chess writes, how do I get my game analyzed? The answer is go to chess.com, type in my last name, Cry, into the forums. You will find it, and there will be a thread posted hopefully tonight or tomorrow where we're going to announce the time and date. It will probably be the last Wednesday of the month. That is going to be next month, the 29th. Sometimes the gnomes at chess.com shove me off to a different date. And of course, this month we got shoved because Christmas next week. All right. What can I do with Twitch channel points? I am not a Twitch wizard, but give them to me, no rematch. Give them all to me. Here we go. h3 didn't make sense to me. This didn't make sense to me. This didn't make sense to me. Okay. And slowly but surely, an interesting thing starts to happen here where Marty is improving his position while his opponent isn't. b4, a6. b5 would have been an interesting move here. It's true that it's a pawn sack because of bishop d2, but that bishop is so worthy that it might be worth it. I didn't mean to make the pun, but it might be worth it. For example, b5. If he doesn't play bishop d2, we're just happy about the b5 because it's giving us a lot of weaknesses. Bishop d2, rook e2, snip, snip, here, king h2, and now he's got to worry about knight f4 and the other rook over. So an interesting endgame pawn sacrifice. Now, the thing I want to stress about king h2 that I don't like, and this is going to be a feature of the game to come, is that you're setting yourself up for a position where the king is cut from the board here, coming back. And so, right, I would rather it not be on h2, but I get it. You had played h3, really, I guess, with that intent. And we're going to see black makes, I think, an instructive mistake later about letting your king back in. So from here on out, let's say that your opponent really allows you to improve the position slowly over the next series of moves. So king f7, first thing he allowed you was b5 is now very playable. f4, b5 is still playable. Rook e3, rook g3. Okay, so here's an instructive moment. the guy takes, and this allows your king to come back. And so a simple thing for him to do is to play rook g8. And note that when we play rook g8, we're trying to make b5 impossible, which I think we are, right? But the other feature of the position that I just want us to note is that now the king is cut from coming back. And it's just pleasant that the guy is in the vizier of the bishop as well. So this position, I think, is big trouble for white. But just instructive, the way the guy slowly slips here to let you back in. Think about it. Your king is much better here on f3 than it is on h2, and it frees the knight on g2 for duties as well. It makes the trauma of the pawn on f4 more livable. Rook g1 seems uncomfortable to me as a pin. Knight h5, you correctly say knight e4 seems better. I agree. Knight e2, he doesn't know what he's doing. Now we make a trade. Big mistake from him where now, well, we can start dreaming. The h-pawn was less of a thing with the rooks on, I felt, because it was every time you moved it, I felt like he was going to invade you. Now I'm not sure. Let's read what you wrote. It's a good bishop and knight against two knights, but black doesn't have a useful pawn break, and white can shut the door on the black king with knight f3. Perhaps black can target f4, but by the time that happens, white could put the knights on d3 and g2. Despite its lonely appearance, h3 is pretty much untouchable as the black knight can't get to the squares where it can attack the pawn. Now, here's an important thing that I guess I describe as mostly psychological, and it happens to everybody, in that you had been suffering through this game and hadn't been able to shift your focus to say, oh, maybe I'm in fact like crushing the guy here. Or not crushing, but maybe I'm the one who has a chance. Instead, you're still in like the lockdown mode because, yeah, I get it. When you have the Irish pawn structure, your expectations aren't that you're going to win the game. But black has slowly but surely completely let you back in the game. And we're going to see the king, I don't really like it on e3 because it should be dreaming of someday being active over here. And we're going to see, I think he gave you that chance later. So king e3, good move, good move, simple, strong chess. All right, king f7, check to the miserable king. King back. Now, of course you're better here, Marty. Come on. King f3, good move. Knight d7, passive. Now, did you have other moves besides knight takes d7? You did. But check this out. Bishop a5, and here you played knight e5 and offered a draw. Okay? Well, I think he's in deep now. I think he's real deep. And the following variation is really instructive when it comes to endgames. By the way, for us old guys playing the young kids, the endgames are really where we have our chance, right? It is truly where we have our chance to shine. And here's, I think, a great variation here. So knight e5 offers a draw. Check this out. King h4. I didn't check with this as a computer. It just felt right to me. And it, first of all, it feels like a pawn sacrifice, right? Because how are we going to defend our business? And the thing about endgames I really want to stress is, whilst I decided to be a boring player, like Paul in New Jersey might decide to be, what I realized is I kind of, through playing the endgames, through being a boring soul, discovered what active chess really means. And you see it when you start sacking pawns in the endgame. And this is a great example of it. So we're going to sacrifice some pawns for our king to be active, and it's truly brutal. If bishop d8, our king is still coming in. And if here, then we come in. You can have our pawn, but look at that. Boom. And this is game over. This is the knight jumping all over the place, and that h-pawn is going to run. So in the game, what instead happened was we went back and forth, and I think the way Marty saw the game was that he had a fortress here, which is true. He has a fortress, but there's every reason to think that we could, even here, that we have chances to win this game. Though, it's no longer some easy proposition. Because now, when we run with the king, his bishop is all set to play something like bishop e3. Though we could still kick him out with king e2 and then do our business later. Okay, Marty, great game. Let's look at Vishnu. Vishnu, I emailed him today because I knew that I had, changed the time and all. It's not the regular time anyway. I said, Vishnu, you're going to lose your streak, buddy. You got to submit a game. And Vishnu, I think, has really been going for it, and to me, an inspirational way. Where, like me, he's got a kid. He's got a real job. I don't really have a real job. I just look at chess stuff and talk to people. I do some chess lessons. He's got a real job and he's working at it. And this game, I think he spent quite a bit of time analyzing it. So I'm just going to try to make a couple remarks that are hopefully cogent. He submitted it just today, so I didn't have too long to look at it. Okay. One thing I think is going on is Vishnu is now playing the Tarrasch, which is a very active opening, and I do think suits his style. Here for white, either d4 or cd, I think, are the best moves. Instead, we get this. And what's going to happen is this thing that white's going to make a series of ugly moves. And how to describe this? Everyone will face this kind of player in their chess career, where, especially as white, they feel the need to provoke you a little bit. And of course, they're playing with fire, and now Vishnu he's just on his own, obviously, after a weird move like knight a3. But all kinds of ghosts can start going through your mind. For example, if you play d4, then you're going to have a Benoni position, where I think black is beautiful, but maybe that's not what you wanted when you woke up this morning, right? Okay, a6, a weird move. You wrote bishop e7 is better. In fact, I like d4. You call it a reversed Kidd structure, and I just want to stress it's a reversed Benoni structure. d3, weird, weird, weird. So the continuation of weird is happening, and it's very possible, I know, at least speaking for myself, to become overconfident in a position like this. And some weird stuff happens. I still think, and I want to say, I think a lot of the weirdness is going on because you refuse to play d4. Okay. Knight c2, and now you play d4. I still believe in your position, but it is getting a little bit strange. b4, good move. And now the guy is, after playing funky move after funky move, is now going to play some moves that make sense. And all of a sudden, Vishnu, the game goes from a position where white was just doing basically nonsense to all of a sudden where his pieces are going to start making sense. And this is psychologically hard when this happens. So, b6, good move. Now, you wrote this is a bad square for the rook, but it's totally natural for you to do it, to get out of the way. So maybe there's, I didn't necessarily think that was the worst move there. Rook c1, good move. I love the way this guy's played the last series of moves. Getting out of the way of dodge, messing with you. And now the guy says no draw and plays rook b2, which you write is a weird move, and I agree. The simplistic thing that he could do, just my first glance thought anyway, is to take this thing, force you to take back with the pawn, and then fix this stupid knight. And I believe in the white position anyway. I don't know what rook b2 does. It's like he's returning to his wayward soul and is going to make some strange moves now. Because I couldn't tell you what rook b2 does. h6 can't be wrong. Knight f6 can't be wrong. Queen c1, weird. So you played bishop e, or excuse me, knight g4, which is truly strange. And maybe we should talk. Well, let's talk about it a little bit. So first of all, I think what you're dreaming of, I'm not sure, is that if the guy plays h3, you want to play knight f2. I'm not even sure you want to do that, but maybe that's your intention with knight g4. The only other thing I can think of is you want to play maybe like some crazy aggression with f5. What you don't want to do, and this is the reason I wanted to stress it, is you really don't want to play knight e5 because your advantage, yeah, I'm not saying you're better, but the virtue of your position is that you have some more space, as is typical in a kind of weird Benoni structure you've got here. And it would also loose the kraken of the bishop on g2. So, right, knight g4 was truly a weird move. And you write bishop e6 was better. Makes sense to me. Almost anything. I don't understand what white's doing, by the way, but, rook e8 also makes sense. White dilly-dally some more. You say bishop e6 is better. Okay. All right, queen, rook c1. Good move. Good move. All right. Now he does this. And now he does this. Okay. So it's like this guy is schizophrenic or something. Sometimes he plays reasonable moves, and sometimes he's playing totally weird. And I will say this, when I play weird players, I get a sense of, a sense that they need to be punished. In a certain sense, they do, but I think that's part of the reason you found yourself in a little grief here. Okay. White, by the way, should really be thinking, really be thinking about knight a3 to c4. I feel like even, instead of rook b7, something like that. Just immediately, fix your knight, bro. Fix that knight. What are you doing? So queen e7, h3, rook b8. Kind of weird. And then you went here for the gold. So now the guy plays knight a3, and I guess your whole intention was hg. You write h4, but I'm assuming it's hg. Rook a8, and then wherever dude goes, like here, we're going to tag him. Something like that, right? Maybe there's some way for him to be a genius here, but I don't know. I don't see it in any clear way. So let's see how this all worked out here. You write, however, that on queen e8, knight fd4 would be an exclam. And right, as long as he makes sense positionally too, he needs to loose the kraken on g2, and then he can take the knight on g4. Okay, because now the queen can escape. Fair enough. All right, so knight a3 happened, which is weird. Like, the guy waited so long to play this knight a3 move. Would have thrown me off too. You played here, and like I said, this is not what we wanted to do. Of course he should take on e5. Of course he should. But now, you're going to have to... It's hard to avoid you trading the knight on e5 off anyway. Now I'm going to guess he's... of course it's a little weird, but we're going to have to say that he's doing great here. The knight on c4 is going to be a good piece. The king will be better protected because he's got more dudes in front of it. You're in time pressure. And he unfortunately can make simple-ish moves, and it's still difficult. Computer wants queen e8. Okay. Simple and strong. And I guess you're in big trouble here. That's my guess. King g2, rook a8, rook b5. This endgame, by the way, totally lost, not just because of the pawn, but because of the active king and rook. What should the guy do? The guy should play king f3. Don't be so fancy. All right, rook b8, b6, rook b7, rook d7. Finally, we get this going. He's being fancy, but honestly now, really instructive coordination of the pieces in the endgame. And I mentioned earlier that we want the pawns on the opposite color of the bishop, and that's definitely going to happen now with f5 coming. Or g5 even, which now you're going to allow us to get it all. Bishop g3, beautiful move. Of course you could play bishop g5. Check this out. Oh, very nice. Check the miserable king mating patterns. It is true what they say. You can mate in the endgame. All right, everybody. Beautiful session today. We'll be back next Wednesday. Paul in New Jersey writes, I got outplayed by a 12-year-old boy in an endgame. Maybe I should submit that game sometime. Don't be traumatized, Paul. You will get those kids, man. They're really tough now. It's like you see less and less old people playing. I count myself among them because the kids are so traumatic to play them. They have puzzle rush scores of 90,000 and they don't understand chess, but then we still lose to them. And it's very, very painful. I speak from personal experience. All right. Ich danke dir, Hiro Koyu. All right, guys. I'll see you guys next month. Thank you so much for being here, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.